The following news flash is brought to you by the Lone Star Lowdown, providing your daily bulletins for the commodities market. Today in history, news updates, and the inside scoop into the tides of the alternative. Markets for the 16th of January, 2016, opened up with gold at $1,088.56 an ounce, silver $13.91 an ounce, Texas crude $29.42 a barrel, and Bitcoin is currently at 366 U.S. currency. Today in history, Friday, January 16th, 1920. The first assembly of the League of Nations is officially held in Paris. The League of Nations was set up as a result of World War I and was disbanded on April 20th, 1946. Almost a year after the founding of the United Nations. In recent news, a Pentagon accountability review found that the Army's Dugway Proving Ground in Utah had inadvertently shipped live anthrax samples for more than a decade. Richard Ebright, a microbiologist at Rutgers University who has testified before Congress on lab safety standards, stated that, quote, "This was not a mere culture of complacency requiring reprimands or employment consequences. This was criminal negligence. There needs to be criminal charges." Of course, Army officials said that there was no findings of any criminal wrongdoing while continually stressing that no single individual was directly responsible for the shipments. The names of a dozen or so individuals who might possibly be facing disciplinary actions, maybe perhaps even possible termination, were blacked out on the report. Currently, labs that work with potential bioterror pathogens are regulated by the Federal Select Agent Program, which are jointly run by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The CDC and the USDA operate their own labs and are part of the departments that fund research at the labs they inspect. The family of deceased Jonas Savimbi, legendary Angolan rebel leader who was assassinated by the MLPA back in 2002, is suing Activision Blizzard for $1 million over the depiction of Savimbi in Call of Duty Black Ops 2. The Guardian states that 3 of Savimbi's children, who claim that the depiction of their dad is that of a half-wit and a barbarian, are using France's strict anti-defamation laws to seek reparations from Activision for damages from their father's depiction in the game. This wasn't the first time that anti-defamation laws were aimed at Activision for this very game. Manuel Noriega, as reported by PC Gamer, also tried suing because he was depicted as a cruel dictator. That case was thrown out. We'll see what comes of this one. This was your lowdown for January 16th, 2016.
From the Liberty Cave at Brave New Books in Austin, Texas, you're listening to the Voice of Reason radio show. The Voice of Reason radio show is the official radio show of the Libertarian Party of Texas. If you'd like to support the Libertarian Party of Texas, go to lptexas.org and tickle that donate button. We are on 89.1 FM Logos Radio here in Austin, Texas. Yeah, the whole network. And joining me right now, as always, is media coordinator for LP Texas, Mr. Nick Reed. Say hello, Nick.
Hello, folks.
And my name is Ben Farmer. We're happy today to have Dr. Mark Miller in the studio with us. He is the candidate right now running for the Texas Railroad Commission in the Libertarian Party. Dr. Miller?
Thanks for having me.
We're happy to have you. So I guess I just wanted to start and talk about what the Railroad Commission is, because I think most people do not understand that this is one of the most powerful and sinister organizations in the entire world. It started in 1891. Maybe I should bring in Dr. Miller here. Can you give us kind of a synopsis of what the Railroad Commission is?
Well, before I head back through the history of all that, the main thing to know currently is that it doesn't have anything to do with railroads and has everything to do with Texas's most important industry, that is oil and gas. The Railroad Commission did start out, interestingly enough, in the railroad business in 1891. It was in an era when Texas was wanting and needing railroads. Vast open spaces, ranchers and farmers needed to be able to get their stuff to market, and the state and the feds actually began giving away a lot of land in exchange for certain monopolistic powers, and thus the need, or at least the desire, for some sort of regulation. And it was really the first progressive era organization. Consumer protection. The farmers and ranchers were upset because they felt like the railroads were charging too much. Anyway, there's a really interesting book by a guy named Childs that traces that whole history of the railroads, and it's really kind of interesting to understand how we got here, not just the Railroad Commission, but regulations in general. And there's two phrases Childs used in his book that gives us libertarians a lot of heartburn. One of them was called dual management, the idea that the railroads and the Railroad Commission would both be managing the railroads. And at that time, the Railroad Commission even calculated the profitability of a railroad to see what they should be charging. The other phrase that was used during that era was pragmatic federalism. Yeah. And you can imagine what that and of course, the thinking behind pragmatic federalism was, particularly with the railroads, was that, look, railroads cross state lines. So there was kind of a role for the federal government for interstate commerce, but the states had a role as well. So that was what the pragmatic federalism. Unfortunately, I think what has happened is pragmatic federalism extended to things that even happen within the state boundaries. Anyway, it wasn't until later in the 20th century that the Railroad Commission began to get power over oil and gas. And it started with Spindletop in 1901. Primarily in the early days, it was the pipelines that the Railroad Commission was involved with. But by 1930, we had something called the East Texas Field. And the East Texas Field, if you haven't read about it, go online and read the history. It is quite interesting. Martial law was actually set by the governor at least twice in the East Texas Field to shut it in.
For what reason?
And the reason was that there was so much oil that could be produced so fast, and everybody had a little plot of land, and there were small independent companies on everybody's lot drilling like crazy. And they were stealing, they were drilling underneath each other's property. It was a mess. Downtown Kilgore at one time, downtown Kilgore had 1,000 active oil wells downtown. And I always tell the people of Denton, your problem is not nearly as severe as Kilgore's was, but there was really chaos, and it was because you had a resource that was exploited and not manufactured, and therefore, and you get into a situation, and it was a shared resource. You know, your neighbor's oil and your oil. When you have this thing we call the rule of capture, you're not quite sure where the oil is coming from, and so the Railroad Commission came in and over the years developed a number of regulations to sort of deal with the fact of competing mineral rights interests. If my property is next to yours, I don't want you sucking all the oil off of my property. I want my fair share. So
I kind of want to skip ahead a little bit and get into why the Railroad Commission of Texas. We understand now, I think if you've been listening, that it has nothing to do with railroads anymore. It is only an oil and gas regulator in the state of Texas. And as such, became a very, very powerful world entity. And I kind of want to skip ahead to, I don't know, late 50s, somewhere around 1960, and talk about what happened as a result of the Railroad Commission, which is that OPEC was founded in order to compete with the Texas Railroad Commission.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ben, because one of the things that eventually happened was in the role of conservation, the Railroad Commission actually was given power to do what was called market-setting conservation. And they actually would determine how much demand there was for oil and then control the supply to meet that demand. Those of us that know anything about economics know that it doesn't work that way.
Right.
And so, in effect, the Texas Railroad Commission was OPEC. And OPEC really didn't come into its own until the Arab oil embargo in the 70s. And in fact, they came into its own so much so that the Railroad Commission's role in setting prices, worldwide oil prices, effectively ceased, although they still have regulatory authority by the legislature to control to market demand in Texas. They simply don't do that any longer.
So what exactly does the Railroad Commission do currently, today?
There's a lot of it that's sort of inside baseball, and that is that when I was talking about competing mineral rights interests, there are lots of regulations that are really about that. And for those that are not in the oil and gas business, we don't care because it's a private matter. But they also have some authority over wastewater injection wells, which are getting increasing attention because of the earthquake activity. They also have authority over pipeline safety. They have some other minor things, but those are the main things that the commission is engaged in.
I want to mention that we are talking to Dr. Mark Miller here in studio right now. He is running for a Railroad Commission on the Libertarian Party of Texas ticket, rather.
And he is the author of Oil and Gas, the Texas Railroad Commission.
Yeah, Lessons for Regulating a Free Society. And I kind of do want to touch on that subtitle right there. What do you mean by regulating a free society?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious.
That is really, I put that subtitle in so people would ask. So let me, because especially libertarians,
right,
because they see regulating and free as being not quite synonymous with each other. A lot of what the Railroad Commission has done, and there's actually chapter 4 in this book goes into some recommendations I have for regulation, has been what I call protection of rights, particularly property rights. And in a sense, when you have really complicated technical problems such as come before the Railroad Commission, the courts sometimes are not capable effectively of dealing with those, particularly if you're a small landowner and you're going up against ExxonMobil or BP.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so it's important to have some government entity that's there to help protect our property rights and our liberties. And that's what I mean by regulating a free society. Is there a role for minimizing and reducing what we put into the regulatory regime so that its primary role is to protect us, to protect our liberties and protect our property?
And as I understand it right now, the Texas Railroad Commission tends to fight the battle from the opposite direction. In other words, Exxon tends to get the best parts of the Railroad Commission. The private property owner kind of gets the shaft most of the time.
Is that kind of what's going on? So we have one private company that's kind of using this government position to get an advantage in the market over property owners?
It's not so much getting an advantage in the market. The problem you've got, the biggest problem in Texas is you have mineral rights that are separated from surface rights.
So I want to outline that in case anyone doesn't know. I grew up in West Texas around the oil field, so this is just a no-brainer to me, but most people don't understand this. When you own property and they find oil underneath it, you don't own the mineral rights. Another entity can come in and purchase those mineral rights. And in Texas, by law, the mineral right owner actually has precedent over the surface right owner.
They have an absolute right to get access to their oil and gas under your property.
So on many, many occasions, I'm sorry, Nick, I'll get right to you, but on many occasions, you'll get a mineral right owner who actually is able to go to a judge and secure a restraining order against the, 70-year-old lady who lives in her house because she lives on the surface.
That's correct.
And that seems odd. Like they literally can't walk onto certain parts of their own property.
Texas is one of the few states where the surface rights have absolutely no power. There are some states where there at least is some financial compensation that's required for the surface owner. I guess in my way of thinking, we should have never allowed the surface and the mineral rights to have been segregated. Think about it. It just creates a problem. When you talk to a rancher that has both the surface and the mineral rights, they don't have a problem. They're getting a check every month.
Sure.
And so they've made a willing transaction to do that.
A voluntary transaction.
Yes, a voluntary one. And a surface owner who's not party to that has no recourse. Now, most of the companies will pay them a little money. They are required to put the land back 30 years from now into its original state. But meanwhile, obviously, the quiet enjoyment of your property has been severely disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. I was going to bring up that point about what the court's doing right now as well. What can we do now, though, about it? Let's say that you got in there as Railroad Commissioner. What can we do differently?
Well, the Railroad Commission actually has very little power, per se, to do that. One of the things that I speak about, though, is that the Railroad Commission is part of Texas' plural executive. It's on a par with governor. It just has, different authorities, but it does not report to the governor. The Railroad Commission reports to the voters, and therefore has an obligation to tell the legislature publicly and loudly what laws need to change to better make oil and gas operations operate in Texas for the benefit of all Texans, not just mineral rights owners. Mm. And so I really feel like the Railroad Commission ought to be speaking out on such things and telling the legislature, look, we need to fix this. And it's going to get worse because the shale resources that we've been developing the last few years, we're in a pause right now, but it's just a pause. They're creeping in close to all kinds of homes. We had the Denton problem from last time. The Barnett Shale is just the beginning. The Eagle Ford Shale is going to get close to Houston. It's going to get close to San Antonio, and it's going to impact people's residences more and more as time goes on. So the railroad commissioners really need to speak out about those things.
I should mention that you are listening to Dr. Mark Miller. This is the Voice of Reason radio show on 89.1 FM, Logos Radio Network. Here in the next segment, I do want to get more into how electing Dr. Miller to the Railroad Commission will be a better option for Texas voters and a better option for all oil and gas people on no matter what side of the issue you are on. So we'll get into that in the next segment. Stick around.
This is the Logos Radio Network.
Whoa, amber is the color of your energy. Whoa, shades of gold displayed naturally. You want to know what brings me here? Blind through my head, blind to fear. And I know
Welcome back to the Voice of Reason radio show, the official radio show of the Libertarian Party of Texas on 89.1 FM, the Logos Radio Network. It is January 16th, 2016, and we are sitting here with Dr. Mark Miller. He is the Libertarian Party candidate for Texas Railroad Commission, which absolutely has nothing to do with railroads and regulates oil and gas. It is one of the most powerful organizations in the world because, as you know, oil and gas basically seeps into everything that we absolutely do. Mark Miller, I think, is the absolute best candidate for this position. He's an actual petroleum engineer. Talk to us about what a petroleum engineer does.
Petroleum engineer, there's several disciplines, sub-disciplines, but basically petroleum engineers are engaged in what's called the upstream part of the business. That is, we're involved in the drilling, producing, and transporting of the product to market, usually to refineries.
And so that you've actually been involved in oil and gas your entire professional career.
Indeed. I started in 1972 in California. I hate to admit I'm that old, but I am. I taught for a while, about 18 years. I taught petroleum engineering at UT Austin. I have a PhD in petroleum engineering. And then after leaving UT, I worked as a consultant, had some worldwide consulting gigs, and I had a small company right before I retired.
As far as I understand it, too, the old parties, the candidates that are running for the old parties are, I don't know, basically just attorneys and that sort of thing.
That's generally the case. There is an engineer who recently is on the commission. He's not really a petroleum engineer. So I'll give him that. But in fact, one of the leading candidates on the Republican side, some legislator promised to give him some schooling in how he should be railroad commissioner. And my line was, how about electing somebody who doesn't need any schooling?
In fact, not only is Dr. Miller a petroleum engineer, but he has actually written the book. It's called Oil and Gas and the Texas Railroad Commission, Lessons for Regulating a Free Society. There's a couple of ways you can get your hands on Dr. Miller's book. Amazon.com is one. Mm-hmm. And I think he said that if you donate to his campaign, you might just get one of these books in the mail. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
Where would they go to donate to your campaign?
www.miller4tx.com.
That's Miller4tx.com.
Miller4tx.com. You'll find a lot of other information on there in addition to how to donate.
So I want to get into what we were starting to talk about in the last segment, which is that, yes, there are very complicated issues with regard to oil and gas in the state of Texas, and that's because we have property rights that are split in half. You have surface rights, so the people who own the top part of the earth, and then the mineral rights, the people who own the things down below. And so this brings up what Dr. Miller wisely called a conflict of property rights. And this is something that libertarians have a difficult time wrapping our minds around a lot of times. But I am assuming, and in fact I know, you have designed a strategy to be fair to both property rights owners.
Or at least to start the conversation. There, chapter 4 of the book, I actually decided I ought to make some real recommendations. Surprise, surprise for a candidate to actually say something about at least improving the power imbalance. I mean, if I've got a conflict with you, Ben, we find a way to work it out because we have an equal power with each other. And so part of the problem you get into is you can't negotiate when somebody's holding a gun to your head. Mm-hmm. And so really these changes that I talk about, many of which will require the legislature stepping in, really are about improving the power imbalance around things like eminent domain seizures for common carrier pipelines, or even the conflict that you're talking about. And I tell people, libertarians are actually the best folks to deal with this conflict because we recognize that all the parties have rights. We recognize it's not one or the other. So the oil companies have rights, the mineral owner has rights, the surface owner has rights, everyone's got rights. And so we're in the best position to help devise regulations and laws and approaches that will recognize and at least find a way to deal with it, encourage negotiations, or find a way like perhaps the Railroad Commission where people can bring their conflicts to people that, and can get some resolution similar to what they might get in the courts, but a little more effectively and efficiently.
Sure. And right now, I kind of want to go into that power imbalance right now. It sounds to me like if you own a big oil company, the Railroad Commission has got your back right now. And is that generally the case?
That arguably, but certainly the perception is there. I sat down on a hearing recently between Shell Oil Company and the General Land Office, and Shell won. Why? Because they had a really good attorney, they had really good engineers, and the General Land Office has one engineer. By the way, the General Land Office is the largest mineral rights owner in the entire state of Texas. And so even the General Land Office was not able to defend themselves adequately. And I don't blame Shell for that. Shell was trying to do what's in their best interest they weren't cheating. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just defending their interest. Now, you have to look, though, at where the commissioners get their campaign donations. Mm-hmm. And it's not from you and me.
Right.
They're getting them from executives, high people in oil and gas for logical reasons. If you're in oil and gas, they affect your business. Why shouldn't you donate to them? and they get a lot of money.
Sure, absolutely. Well, what is your campaign looking like these days? I know you've had a busy schedule this week. Where all have you been?
Well, this week I was on the radio a couple days ago with the National and
the National Libertarian
Party. And I have been up in Tarrant County and other places visiting. We've got a pretty big activity set up. I've got a dozen people on my campaign that really want to work. We've raised several $1,000s, and so are able to mount a good campaign. I'm retired, devoting my full-time effort to this, and really planning to do a big push between now and Election Day. Of course, the first big push is before the party's convention in April. Mm-hmm. I'm very confident NOTA won't win. For those of you that don't know, NOTA we have none of the above as an option.
Always in our party.
And I'm pretty confident, especially since I was the candidate in 2014, that I'll be on the ballot, and we just got to figure out how to get people out there and get them to vote.
And it is very important to the Libertarian Party of Texas that people actually go out there and vote this time around. Our ballot access is in jeopardy. Dr. Miller is running in one of the campaigns that can maintain our ballot access. The way the law is written, we fight this in every single legislative cycle, and the old parties do everything they can to hold us down. And what we have to do is get over 5% of the vote in a statewide election. In a normal year, that would be a governor's race, something like that. Well, there's not a governor's race this time around. The top of the ballot statewide election is this election for Railroad Commission. So it is highly important that we go and we get Dr. Miller over 5% of the vote, or you won't have libertarians on the ballot in 2018. It's just as simple as that.
So if you're worried about voting, Railroad Commissioner will be the third line on the ballot behind the President, Vice President, and your congressman. If all you want to do is vote for a Railroad Commissioner, that'd be perfect. That gets me over the top and keeps us having ballot access. Besides, I think if we can get to 10%, Ben, we'll be part of the political dialogue in a way we've never been in the past.
Yeah, and that's the point. What we kind of discovered in the last legislative session, which we'll definitely talk about on a later show at some point, but we have started to become kingmakers. Well, maybe not kingmakers. We've started to be included in the conversation. We've done this through a lot of different methods, but one of which is actually just direct lobbying efforts and coalition building. It's allowed us to actually go into legislators' offices, and instead of just saying we're with the Libertarian Party of Texas and watch them roll their eyes and not care, we're able to go in and say we're part of a larger group, like Texans for Accountable Government, for instance. You guys are very familiar with the work that they do, with the Texas Anti-Corruption Campaign, and lots of other coalitions that we're able to join and actually affect legislation. So with this, I think they saw that we are becoming a factor and are looking for a great opportunity to kick us off the ballot. And anyone who's ever been involved in trying to get on the ballot, once you're off of it, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money, and basically doesn't put us completely out of business, but it makes things much, much more difficult to do business. So I would encourage people, even in the anarchist community, just go hit the button this one time. Or not just this one time. Go hit the button. You're playing self-defense. It's just like I don't ever want to shoot a gun, or I don't ever want to kill anybody, but I will use a gun in self-defense, and I think we can use politics in the same way. Dr. Mark Miller is a candidate for Texas Railroad Commission here in the state of Texas. The election is going to be this November. If you'd like to support Dr. Miller's campaign, go to Miller4Tex.com. That's Miller, the number 4, TX.com. And we are getting close to a break, so I may as well just wrap it up here anyways. You're listening to the Voice of Reason radio show on 89.1 FM, the Logos Radio Networks, and we will catch you guys on after this break.
Health-conscious consumers are ditching plastic food containers, worried about leaching chemicals. Are they being health-wise or just paranoid? I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and I'll wade into the controversy over plastics and health next.
Privacy is under attack. When you give up data about yourself, you'll never get it back again. And once your privacy is gone, you'll find your freedoms will start to vanish too. So protect your rights, say no to surveillance, and keep your information to yourself. Privacy, it's worth hanging on to. This message is brought to you by StartPage.com, the private search engine alternative to Google, Yahoo, and Bing. Start over with StartPage.
Concern over plastic is rising, prompted by some studies that say compounds in water bottles and food packaging can cause cancer, infertility, and birth defects. But is ditching plastic a good idea? Most concerns focus on BPA, a compound used in plastic softeners. Some scientists say these compounds leach into food and drinks, but the plastic industry says otherwise, noting that experimental findings have not been repeated. Until scientists can agree on plastics, what should we do? Personally, I avoid plastic bottles and packaged meals. After all, fresh food can only do us good. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht for StartPage.com, the world's most private search engine.
You're listening to the Logos Radio Network at logosradionetwork.com.
Looking for my place on assembly lines, fake prizes rising out of the bomb holes. Skeleton boys hide up on purple.
Welcome back to the Voice of Reason radio show, the official radio show of the Libertarian Party of Texas. If you're interested in supporting the Libertarian Party of Texas, please go to lptexas.org and find that donate button. In the last half hour, we were talking to Dr. Mark Miller. He is running for Railroad Commission here in the state of Texas. And we just lucked out and were able to pull on Dr. Laura Corr for this second half hour here. She is a specialist in countering violent extremism, terrorist de-radicalization, and global security issues. She's got a PhD in international relations and Master of Letters from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where the Gulf comes from, and a BA from Mount Holyoke College. Hello, Dr. Laura. How can I call you Dr. Laura? Or is that already, that's trademarked probably?
It's probably, yeah, I think it is trademarked for sure.
Well, thank you. Welcome. What do you see, and this is, I know, a very broad question. What do you see as the number one thing we could do to prevent terrorism in our country?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your inaugural show.
I know, it's very exciting. None of us know what we're doing. We're shooting from the hip.
I think when we address the issues of countering violent extremism in the United States, that's one of the top issues. And how to do that specifically, there's a lot of avenues. One is communities kind of talking about it and prioritizing how do we counter violent extremism in our communities. Should we prioritize that? Should we put funds into that? Should we talk about training on that? And also, one of the more important issues, I firmly believe, is combating violent extremism online. So that's through Twitter, that's through Kik, Facebook, and other social media. We need to hold those social media businesses accountable for the weaponization and misuse of their platforms by jihadis that target American citizens and our government.
How do you manage the balance between holding those entities accountable and the freedom of speech?
Yeah, that is very much a very tough question right now that everyone's talking about. Because, obviously free speech is very important, but when you have people that are honing and recruiting and radicalizing people online, there has to be a pushback. There has to be a response that's adequate. We have U.S. citizens going abroad. We have young women signing up to go overseas, become jihadi brides, all from Twitter, Instagram, and they get lured in by jihadi love stories with what they think are cute pictures of AK-47s and teddy bears.
In the Libertarian Party, we get often accused of having an isolationist foreign policy. I don't necessarily think that's fair. Isolationism seems to me to be like what North Korea's policy is. Ours is more of a non-interventionist policy. And I think a lot of the people who would listen to this show would think the best way to stop terrorism is to stop participating in it. I wonder if you think if the radicalization is caused by us like bombing people all the time. Or if
well, that's definitely used as a recruitment tool. It's definitely used for a lot of people's discussions of like us versus them, or look what's happening, or look what people say your government is doing. So actions do have repercussions for sure. When we think about counterterrorism and those types of strikes, that it is going to have conversations, it is going to have pictures, it is going to have impact and blowback or retaliation.
So can I ask you? It seems like these terrorist attacks are a real lashing out. In your experience and from your research, do you see that there's a real connection between some of the systemic problems that we're having, such as oppression and such as intervention overseas, and some of this lashing out? Is this people who don't have this is a last resort? They feel like they don't have another option? They don't have a voice? Or is this something else?
I think it's something else. When you look at so many of the groups and people involved in terrorist groups, or they don't really have a profile. They're well educated. They lack formal education. They're from lower, upper middle class. Like, they have great options. Some of them don't have options. Like, there's just no real one trigger that makes people go into terrorism or join a terrorist group. No one wakes up one day and says, "Oh, I'm going to become a terrorist today." It's a process. It's a pathways. It's so many different triggers that makes people consider these groups or even pursue terrorism.
That's interesting. I guess I kind of am or was of the mindset that there must be a certain type of person that gets into terrorism. But what you're saying, that's not at all the case, that they come from all walks of life and all come from all sorts of situations.
They really do. I mean, one person I interviewed in my research was a religious scholar that his job was to go into prisons to help rehabilitate and teach radicalized Islamists a more moderate form of Islam. And he was alleged radicalized, and he was placed on a terror watch list several years after I interviewed him. So, I mean, you would have been the last person you would have thought would have been radicalized or would have thought this is the way he wants to go with his life. When you think about a lot of the 9/11 bombers, they came from really good families. They were well educated. They had so many opportunities that you can't help but think, why?
So I guess that's the question. Are we starting to hone in on the why? Do we know?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a large amount of research and people kind of talking about, like, okay, what brings people into these movements? What makes them want to even consider these acts as a possibility? A lot more is being done in Europe and Asia into the pathways and radicalization than the U.S. currently, which is rather unfortunate. I hope the U.S. would catch up on that and slowly but surely would consider that.
So since I've got you here, a question that I've always wanted to be able to ask somebody who might actually be able to answer it is, who would benefit from something like this? I mean, let's say that there's something else involved in this. Is there what benefits? What is the actual effect of these terroristic attacks in the world, in our socio-political systems, and how do they change in some certain way?
Well, what they want is fear-based responses. Is to cause fear. It's to act as a destabilizing force. It's, for many, there's a field of like state-sponsored terrorism where states will want to pursue those options to perhaps destabilize their neighbors. When we think about terrorism, what is the point of it? It's a tool. It's to cause fear and mistrust. So that's why it's a rather sad, effective tool.
And I would say it is effective as we look at people like the Donald Trump campaign and events, supporters. It seems like it's all based, right? So are they? In that regard, are they winning? They're winning because we're being scared of these people and we're preventing children from immigrating. And how do we combat irrational fear when there is a rational reason to be afraid somehow? How do we combat that?
I think it's, in my field, we call it building social resilience. It's really kind of taking the challenge of looking at the situation, looking at solutions, and saying, okay, how do we bond? How do we evolve? How do we, as they say in the field, take a hit and move forward? And that's from kids, that's building, our policies. So when we kind of think about, are they winning? I don't think they're winning. I think that we're going through right now is just have a response, and hopefully we'll be able to be stronger.
We'll be stronger. You just mean more emotionally resilient? You mean actually militarily stronger as maybe we survive and slow down all over the place? You don't mean that, right?
So, we should start wiping out people. No. I mean, like, stronger is looking at communities, looking at our policies, looking at, okay, we have these local online communities. How do we help communities and parents understand like what they're looking at, or help people not have those pathways and terrorism groups? So that's what I meant by stronger.
I guess I should clarify because it would not be fair to say we should start doing that. It seems very clear. We are doing that. We're buying people all over the world all the time, and I don't see that it's helping. I don't see it doesn't seem to be helping to me. It seems like the fear of terrorism is only ever increasing. We only have about 20 seconds left. Then maybe we should just drop off right there. And I should mention that we are guys listening to Logos Radio Networks. We got Dr. Laura Corin here. She is a terrorist specialist, I guess. A specialist in terrorism. I will catch up with you guys on the
Easy.
This is a farmhouse. We have cluster flies and lights, and this time of year is bad. We are so very sorry. There is little we can do but swat them. She didn't beg, not enough. She didn't stay when things got tough. I told a lie, she got mad.
Welcome back to the Logo Radio Network, listening to the Voice of Reason radio show. The official radio of the Libertarian Party of Texas. So I'll remind you, if you want to support the Libertarian Party of Texas, go to LTexas.org. Happy to have you in studio with Laura Moore, Dr. Laura Core is a specialist at counting violent extremism. Dr. Mark Miller, who is our candidate for Libertarian Party.
The stinging lash, every man rise from the ash. Each betrayal begins with trust. Every man returns to dust. I never ever saw the northern lights. I never really heard a cluster of flies. Never ever saw the stars so bright. In the farmhouse days will be alright. I never ever saw the northern lights. I never really heard a cluster of flies. Never ever saw the stars so bright. Things will be alright. I never ever saw the northern lights. I never really heard a cluster of flies. Never ever saw the stars so bright. In the farmhouse things will be alright. I never ever saw the northern lights. I never really heard a cluster of flies. Saw the stars so bright. In the promise things will be alright.
You are listening to the Voice of Reason radio show here on the Logos Radio Networks. The Voice of Reason is the official radio show of the Libertarian Party of Texas. If you'd like to support the Libertarian Party of Texas, go to lptexas.org. We are sitting in studio with Dr. Laura Core. Dr. Laura Core is an expert in the field of terrorist de-radicalization. We also got Dr. Mark Miller here in studio with us, who is the Libertarian Party candidate for Railroad Commission. And an interesting conversation popped up over the break, and I think we should express that here on the show. And Dr. Miller asked, are the pathways to becoming a terrorist similar to the pathways to become a member of a gang? And I wanted to get Dr. Core's opinion on that.
Well, definitely. When you look at gangs and how they recruit and how they have so much loyalty, there's a lot of similarity when we look at gangs and how, in comparison to terror groups, and how they recruit and how they ensure loyalty. For example, a lot of terrorist groups will make sure that the single men marry, sisters or cousins, and that's another way to ensure loyalty to the group. It's harder to break away. It's harder to walk away when, your wife's brother is also high in the movement. So very similar to gangs in that sense.
That's really interesting, Doctor. Isn't that also what monarchies have done throughout history? That they've kind of, I wouldn't say interbred, but they've really tried to keep the bloodline close to keep the power and to keep a certain sense of loyalty. And I think that at some point they also had kind of genetic problems. Now, we may not be able to tie connections specifically between terrorism and state-sponsored because really it's just really tough. But, there was a classroom once that had a big gang fight when I was substituting once. And I asked them where they learned it, and they said that it was the same thing that the schools were doing to them. And we had a really great discussion about it. But they described the school as a giant gang, and if they didn't do what the teacher said, and they were talking to me, that I was going to get the security guard. And if that didn't work, it was the principal. If that didn't work, their parents were involved. And then the police, and that was the biggest gang right there, they said. And it was a really interesting discussion, but I really wanted to know what you had to think about it.
About your classroom experience? Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So can you repeat your question again? Okay, so when we think about like terrorism and the gang mentality, that's what makes de-radicalization so hard, is that
how do you get people to walk away when they have so much invested, so much time, so much what they feel is a sacrifice, and in the sense of, they're literally married to so many of their, fellow terrorists, like other families. So when we think about, that kind of gang component, it's so hard to have people walk away, because what is it they know? What is it they train? What is it that they first resort to? It's their families. It's their gang families too. Same thing with terror groups. When you have one person radicalized, you typically have to look at the rest of the family and how that person is either detained or arrested. That has an effect on the families and how they view either that government or the police officers, and that can be used as a radicalizing tool. So you have to really get the families involved to help people walk away and disengage and leave terror groups. Same thing with gangs.
Yeah, I just, from an oil and gas perspective, I have a couple of observations. I've spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East, and one of the things I've noticed in visiting the Middle East is the societies the countries over there that are the most open to Westerners and Western ways, or at least tolerant of them, are those that historically have done the most trading. They were the ones that were right on the Persian Gulf, and I know we've got an awful lot of terrorists that have come from Saudi Arabia, which is a much more tribal history to it, and more inland. And my question would be, from the perspective of us libertarians, free trade is one of the answers. And a more open world is one at which, if people don't have an opportunity there, maybe they have an opportunity somewhere else. And I feel that way. We talk a lot about the immigration problem between the U.S. and Mexico. There's oil and gas, the Eagle Ford Shale. The drilling sort of stops at the Rio Grande. Well, the geology doesn't stop at the Rio Grande. The drilling stops at the Rio Grande. And I try to imagine a world in which there is a vibrant oil and gas industry, workers on both sides of the border, going across, families living there, everybody, the communities have an interest. Drug violence has got to go down. Terrorism has to go down in those kinds of environments. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I agree with you that if you give people other opportunities, I would argue help lower, counter terrorism, in the sense that several of the more popular and successful de-radicalization programs are prison-based, where they train the detainees skills so they don't go back to the movement and back to what they have been trained for previously. So if they're given other opportunities, other ideas, there's a higher chance that they will successfully walk away and never go back to that movement, never go back to their roles in those terror groups. So I agree with you when you think about other opportunities and ideas, that is paramount to success. One program I researched had former detainees go back and talk to detainees in prison, and then after they were successfully released into society with training and social work help, they actually had multimillionaires that had completely different lives, and they owed their success to, I was trained, I got this program, and they actually gave money back to that prison de-radicalization program. They said, I used to be a terrorist, but I left, I was trained differently, and I was able to walk away. But that's after special branch said that person can leave, after the religious scholar said that person's not a threat. So when we look at de-radicalization programs and the idea of countering terrorism, ideas and different approaches are necessary, and so are opportunities. So I hope that kind of answered your question. Okay.
Yeah, I think now we're starting to touch on the libertarian issue of the free exchange of not only markets, but the free exchange of ideas. And this is why I think most of us would bristle at the idea of going after Twitter or Facebook, where yeah, bad ideas happen, but you're also going to stifle the free exchange of good ideas in that way too. Or at least you're going to replace it with perhaps the bad ideas of maybe our own government. I mean, our own government isn't always right about things, but somehow the ideas that are acceptable to this government are better than the ideas of another government. You're starting to get into a scary thing. Our brainwashing is good, their brainwashing is bad. I think that's why most libertarians would think, we would rather have freedom than, we would not want to trade freedom for security. Ultimately, we think freedom is the best pathway to security because it provides more opportunities, it provides better markets, there's more opportunity. Freedom good, scary security bad. So we are coming up to the end of the program here. This was our first show. We were met with some difficulty here, but I want to thank both of our guests, Dr. Mark Miller, running for Railroad Commission here in the state of Texas, and Dr. Laura Cord. Sure appreciate the two of you guys coming on. And so as we go out, remember, we'll be back next Saturday at 4 p.m. This is the Voice of Reason radio show on the Logos Radio Network. If you want to support the Libertarian Party of Texas, please remember to go to lptexas.org and tickle that donate button. I've been Ben Farmer, and I will be back.